their biological advantage and increasing their numbers in the population. Or I should say men increasing their numbers in the population. So from 1870 to about 1910, a time which was kind of a retrograde time in American history where we kind of went all neo-traditional and went back to conservative Victorian values, and not surprisingly you saw the number of men increase relative to the number of women. But you have this huge decline starting in the 1920 roughly to really about the 1980s, where the number of women increased dramatically relative to the number of men. Now, why is this? Let me just tell you a story. Now, as you can see at the top of the screen, a lot of this had to do with Social Security. And so let me just show you another chart that kind of illustrates this. So this shows you the sex ratio at two ages. One is a sex ratio for those under 5 years old, and the other one is a sex ratio for those over 65. So the sex ratio over time for those under 5 is the red line. And if you look at that, you can see that it's basically a flat line over time. If anything, there are more boys being born than girls now compared to the 1860. But if you look at the over 65 population, what you can see is that this big push is basically driven by elderly women, women over 65, where there's a lot more women than men at this age level. And as people live longer, what you're seeing is women piling up their advantages relative to men. There's a lot more elderly women than elderly men in society, and they're realizing the biological advantage, because as the men drop off, the women are still standing. But why did this happen only in the 1930s or 1940s on? Well, a lot of this has to do with Social Security. When you have a pension, when women don't have to depend upon men for their income because they're working themselves, or they can receive old age support, guess what? Women can survive to 65, 70, 80 years old because they're living on the pensions, they're living on Social Security, they have a way of supporting themselves even if they're not working, and they don't depend upon their income from their husbands to support them in their old age, which means now women are on an equal playing field relative to men, and not surprisingly, you see the gap open at these older age levels. Now, just another way of looking at this is that there are different, let's say, sex ratios, and this is, let's say, different social networks, and this is just kind of a cautionary tale. So I'm sure that some of you are part of these different online social networks like Facebook or Flickr, Friendster, MySpace, My Yearbook, etc. And it shows you the proportion of women on these networks versus the proportion of men. And the trend you see across all these networks, although at different rates for different networks, is that there's a huge overrepresentation of teenage girls. Girls from basically age 15 to age 22, 23. Okay, so on these social networks, you have an incredible number of teenage girls. Maybe that's not surprising, but basically, if you wanted to look at who's actually on Facebook, who has a Facebook account, who's most active on Facebook, teenage girls. Guys, not so involved. And so you almost have, at the age of 15, almost 2 girls for every guy, let's say, on a social networking site like Facebook. But it's not a constant. You can see that if you look over age, the sex ratio changes. You also seem to have a lot of middle-aged men, because you can see this thing coming down roughly late 20s through the 40s, where there's a lot more men on these social networking sites. So you have teenage girls, middle-aged men. Just put this as a cautionary tale. And if you look on your right-hand side, you can kind of see the different sex ratio at different age groups. So until 15 to 25 people on these social networking sites, overwhelmingly female. From 35 to 40, you get, let's say, a dip, and you start to get more men than you would otherwise. You go into 40s, 50s. Once again, you see a lot of women popping up. The number of women, let's say, is larger. A lot of them might be for changing social status, women to finish childhood, finish raising children, which means they might be more active as far as their social networks. Their lives are not focused around the household. And then you have elderly men, and you have a much higher representation. Now, this is not just to make any particular point about economics, but just to show you how you can use the sex ratio to kind of understand social patterns. I want to compare what was happening in the United States with what was happening in China. So in China, since the late 1970s, early 1980s, they've had this one-child policy. And what's happened as a result of the one-child policy is that you've had a lot more boys born than girls, because they're using ultrasound and other types of things to identify the sex of the child. And in China, abortion is not frowned upon particularly. And so if you have an ultrasound and the fetus turns out to be female, what often happens in many Chinese households is they have an abortion, because they would rather have a son than a daughter. And so what you can see is, if you look at the sex ratio of children born in China, you can see it went from relatively stable. You had slightly more women than men from the 1950s until the 1980s. And then starting in the 1980s, you started to have a lot more boys being born than girls, ever since the beginning of the one-child policy. And so what you've had is you have a lot more men being born than women. Why is, well, other than the fact that we had now the current generation of Chinese men, people around Mr. Brunelli's age, there's a lot of men out there without women. So there's a lot of men basically striking out in the marriage and dating market just because there's not actually enough women compared to the men at these different marrying or household raising age groups. And that's one type of problem. The other problem is that who takes care of elderly people? Now, in a society like China, it's overwhelming female. So if you're not having daughters, and you're not having daughters-in-law, because you're underproducing the number of women in the society, guess what happens to the elderly? There's no one to take care of them. And so what you're seeing in China is this very interesting phenomenon. As the number of men is going up, as the sex ratio is going up, which might say as the number of men is increasing and the number of women is decreasing, you're seeing it almost perfectly tracks the saving rate. So this little equation here on the right-hand side, y minus c divided by y, is income minus consumption divided by income. So if you have income minus consumption, the remainder is savings. So this is basically a representation of the savings rate. And this is, I think, research by Shangjin Wei. I might have the name wrong there. But on the website VoxEU, and you can see that as the number of women is declining, the amount of savings has gone up. Because when there's less women, guess what? There's less people taking care of the elderly. People have to save more money to take care of themselves in old age, because they're not going to get free daughter-in-law or free daughter taking care of them when they reach, let's say, age 60, 65, 70. And so you're seeing the sex ratio kind of predicting the amount of savings. Now, this is actually a relatively well-known general relationship. As societies get older, they tend to save more because they have to, let's say, save money to provide for themselves, and they tend to, let's say, produce more. But we'll get more into this a little bit later on. So I'm not going to belabor it too much now, other than to note, the sex ratio, the number of women to men, does have a huge effect on macroeconomic variables like the savings rate, which can have a huge effect on investment, consumption, taxes, and how fast the economy is growing. So if you actually had more women than men, you might have a higher consumption rate and a lower savings rate. Now, I just want to get to this idea of shrinking populations, because we kind of start with Malthus and this idea that we have overpopulations, the populations are getting out of control. And I want to talk a little bit about what happens when the workforce shrinks. Now, a great example of this is Japan, a country where women are having really about one child for every 2 women in the population, basically implying that Japan is shrinking over time. There's not enough children to make up for the elderly people, and when those elderly people die off, there's not enough children to replace them. Now, this also is a problem because it's the people in the workforce that support both the elderly population and also the youth population, right? Your parents are supporting your grandparents, or at least will support your grandparents, and they're also supporting you. And for the most part, people over 65 and people under age 20 are not really contributing productively to the economy. It's that population in the center, the population between roughly age 20 and age 60, that's producing all the value in society. Everyone else is basically an unproductive consumer. And here you have 3 population pyramids showing the change over time in Japanese society. Obviously, the 2050 is a projection. So in 1950, this is what the Japanese population looked like. 35% of the population was under 15, 5% of the population was over 65, and about 60% of the population was 15 to 65. Obviously, you have a lot more children, so the point is it's weighted toward, it's a young society. And if you looked at a population pyramid anywhere in the developing world, it would look relatively similar to this. As you can see, lots of young people, a decreasing number of old people. Remember, people are dying off over time, so the older you get, the more likely you're going to die and disappear from the society's population, and kind of reaching an apex point at the top. You can also see a few other things here. If you look on the left-hand side of the 1951, which is the male side of the population pyramid, you can see there's a little bite taken out from ages roughly 20 to ages 40. Those are all the men who died in World War II. Right? The men died fighting the battles like Iwo Jima and Saipan and Okinawa. Women basically unscathed. Okay. Now, the children in 1950 are, let's say, the 50-year-olds in 2003. So what's happened to the population pyramid? Well, we have a lot fewer young people. Instead of making up 35% of the population under 15 is now only 14% of the total population. The workforce has grown, right? All those young people in 1950 are now people in the workforce, so they've kind of moved through this. They're now higher up on this population pyramid. And you're also seeing a lot more people living to older ages. Instead of only 5% of the population over 65, it's now 20%. So you still have a large workforce that's supporting the elderly and the young in society, okay, but it's not as good as it was before, especially because there's not enough people at the bottom to keep moving up to the top. Because remember, the number of children born 20 years ago, okay, you can't have more people than were born 20 years ago. You can't instantly create 20-year-olds. You have to first have 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds. And so if you didn't have them 20 years ago, you're not going to have them now. Well, if we follow these trends into the future, into 2050, you can see what's going to happen in Japanese society. Eventually, you're going to have it flipped. You're going to have about 35% of the population over 65, only about 10% of the population under 15, and you're going to see the workforce shrink and shrink. And the point is, its ability, the people who are actually working, their ability to support people who are not working, is going to decline. And you can kind of see this by looking at different societies in the United States. So we have 3 communities. We have Sandy, Utah, what I presume is a Mormon community, lots of children. And as you can kind of see here, you have kind of this oil lamp kind of shape here. You have a lot of people in the childbearing ages and a lot of children and very few older people relative. Then you have a kind of a singles big city like Washington, D.C. People live in cities. Generally, there's lots of 20, 30-somethings, but they're not actually raising their families because once they get children, they tend to move out to the suburbs, and you tend to have fewer children